In the year 1324, a king crossed the Sahara Desert. He brought with him no army. He declared no war. He sought no territory. And yet, by the time he left Egypt, the most powerful economy in the Mediterranean world lay in ruins. His name was Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, Lord of the gold mines that fed 3 continents. And his wealth was so incomprehensible that when he decided to give it away, he broke an entire nation's economy for more than a decade. This is the story of the pilgrimage that changed the world. Not through conquest, not through bloodshed, but through gold. To understand what happened in Cairo in 1324, we must first travel back to a world most people have never been taught about. A world where Africa was not on the margins of history, but at its very center. The year is 1300. Europe is struggling through famine, war, and the lingering trauma of the Crusades. The Mongol Empire stretches across Asia like a scar. The Islamic world connects 3 continents through trade, scholarship, and faith. And deep in West Africa, there exists an empire so rich, so powerful, that its wealth would become the stuff of legend, the Mali Empire. But here's what makes this remarkable. Most people in medieval Europe had no idea it even existed. Maps from this period show Africa as a vast, mysterious blank space. Cartographers filled the edges with monsters and speculation. The scholars of Paris and London believed that beyond the Sahara lay only wasteland and savages. They were catastrophically wrong. While European kingdoms struggled to mint enough coins to pay their armies, the Mali Empire sat atop the richest gold deposits ever discovered in the medieval world. The Bambouk goldfields, the Bure goldfields. Deposits so vast that Mali controlled nearly half of the world's gold supply. Let that sink in for a moment. One empire, half the world's gold. In the markets of Cairo, Venice, and Baghdad, merchants traded in Malian gold without knowing where it came from. They called it the gold of the Sudan, the land of the blacks, but the exact location remained a closely guarded secret. The emperors of Mali understood something fundamental about power: control the resource, control the world. And they protected that secret with ruthless efficiency. Caravans crossed the Sahara carrying the precious metal northward. Salt, copper, and finished goods traveled south. The cities of Timbuktu, Gao, and Jannah became cosmopolitan centers of learning and commerce, where scholars debated philosophy while merchants haggled over prices in a dozen languages. Gold coins minted in Mali circulated from Marrakesh to Mecca, from Alexandria to Andalusia. The economy of North Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe ran on Malian gold, even if they didn't know it. This was the world of interconnected trade routes where wealth flowed along ancient pathways carved by centuries of commerce, where a drought in the Sahel could affect bread prices in Damascus, where the rise and fall of empires turned on access to salt, gold, and slaves. And at the heart of this vast economic web sat Mali. But empires are not built on gold alone. They're built on systems, on governance, on the ability to project power without destroying the very thing that makes you powerful. The Mali Empire had emerged from the ashes of the Ghana Empire, which had collapsed under pressure from the Almoravid dynasty and internal fractures. A brilliant general named Sundiata Keita had united the Mandinka people, defeated the tyrant Soumaoro Kante at the Battle of Kirina, and established a new political order. The empire Sundiata built was sophisticated beyond what European contemporaries could imagine. It had a constitution, the Kurukan Fuga, that established laws, protected certain rights, and created a framework for governance. It had a professional army, a bureaucracy, a system of provincial administration that allowed local rulers autonomy while ensuring loyalty to the Mansa, the emperor, and it had gold. More gold than any kingdom on earth. By 1300, Mali was not merely rich, it was the definition of wealth itself. But wealth attracts attention, and power creates expectations. The Islamic world knew of Mali's existence, even if Europe did not. Scholars in Cairo and Baghdad had heard tales of the legendary kingdoms beyond the Sahara. They knew that somewhere in the darkness, south of the desert, lay cities of learning and kings who commanded armies in the tens of thousands. But knowing about something and seeing it are very different things. In 1312, a new emperor ascended to the throne of Mali. His name was Musa Keita. History would remember him as Mansa Musa, Emperor Musa, and he was about to show the world exactly what power looked like. Every great story has a moment of transition, a hinge upon which history turns. For Mali, that moment came with blood and mystery. Mansa Musa was not supposed to be emperor. According to the chronicles and oral traditions, Musa came to power because his predecessor, Mansa Abubakar II, had become obsessed with a question that would seem absurd to most medieval rulers. What lies beyond the Atlantic Ocean? Abu Bakr II had sent expeditions westward into the endless blue. Ships loaded with provisions, sailors, and the emperor's burning curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. The first expedition never returned. The second expedition set out with Abu Bakr II himself aboard. They sailed into the Atlantic and vanished. Some historians believe this is legend. Others point to the sophisticated shipbuilding traditions of West Africa and argue it's entirely plausible. We may never know the truth. What we do know is this: Abu Bakr II disappeared, and Musa, who had been left as regent, became emperor. But Mansa Musa was not merely a placeholder. He was a man of vision, ambition, and an understanding of power that went far beyond military conquest. He inherited an empire at its zenith. The gold mines were producing unprecedented wealth. The trade routes were secure. The provinces were stable. Mali controlled territory stretching from the Atlantic coast to the edges of modern Nigeria, an area larger than Western Europe. For many rulers, this would have been enough. Consolidate, maintain, enjoy the fruits of power. Mansa Musa saw opportunity. He was a devout Muslim, ruling an empire where Islam had become the religion of the elite, while traditional African religions remained strong among the common people. This religious landscape created both challenges and opportunities. Islam provided Mali with a connection to the wider world. It gave Musa legitimacy in the eyes of North African and Middle Eastern powers. It linked Mali to a network of scholarship, trade, and diplomacy that stretched from Spain to India. And it gave Musa an obligation. Every Muslim who is physically and financially able must make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in their lifetime. It is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, a journey that transcends social class, race, and nationality. In Mecca, a beggar and a king are equal before God. But Mansa Musa was not interested in equality. He was interested in making a statement, a declaration, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that the world would never forget it. He began planning his pilgrimage with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to governance. This would not be a simple religious journey. This would be a spectacle, a diplomatic mission, a calculated display of Mali's wealth and sophistication. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Mecca lay thousands of miles away, across the Sahara Desert, through Egypt, and into the Arabian Peninsula. The journey would take more than a year. It would require crossing one of the most hostile environments on Earth, where temperatures could kill a man in hours and water was worth more than gold. Any normal pilgrimage required careful planning: food, water, guides, protection from bandits and the elements. Mansa Musa was planning something beyond normal comprehension. He would bring his entire court, his wives, his officials, his scholars, his soldiers. He would bring so much gold that everywhere he stopped, people would speak of nothing else for generations. This wasn't just about religious obligation. This was about changing how the world saw Africa. For centuries, the Islamic world had viewed sub-Saharan Africa as a source of golden slaves, valuable but primitive, a place to extract resources, not a civilization to respect. Mansa Musa was about to shatter that perception with the sheer weight of his treasure, but there was another calculation at work here, something more subtle and more brilliant. Mali's wealth depended on secrecy. The location of the goldfields was protected information. The mining techniques were closely guarded. European and Arab merchants paid premium prices for Malian gold precisely because they couldn't access the source. But this created a problem. If no one truly understood how rich Mali was, how could Musa leverage that wealth for diplomatic and political power? The pilgrimage solved this problem. Musa would reveal Mali's wealth, not by exposing the goldfields, but by spending so extravagantly that the world would have no choice but to acknowledge Mali as a true superpower. He would buy respect, admiration, and political influence with generosity on a scale never before witnessed. It was a gamble, a calculated risk. Flood the market with gold and you might devalue it. Spend too freely and you might look foolish rather than powerful. Reveal too much wealth and you might invite conquest. But Mansa Musa understood something that many rulers miss. Power is not just about what you have. It's about what people believe you have. And he was about to make believers of them all. In 1324, Mansa Musa departed from Niani, the capital of Mali, and began the journey that would change history. The caravan that assembled was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Imagine for a moment trying to comprehend a number beyond your experience. Historical sources tell us that Mansa Musa's caravan included 60,000 people. 60,000. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the population of most European cities in 1324. That's an entire nation on the move. But numbers alone don't capture what this meant. Let's break down what we know about this extraordinary procession. At the front rode Musa's military escort, 500 slaves, each carrying a staff of pure gold, weighing approximately 4 pounds. Not gold-plated, not gold-gilded, solid gold. Think about that. 2,000 pounds of gold carried as staffs by slaves who served purely ceremonial purposes. Behind them came Musa's personal retinue, his senior wives, his officials, the royal heralds, the empire's most important scholars and imams, each traveling in a manner befitting their status, with servants, supplies, and their own shares of treasure. Then came the camels. Accounts vary, but conservative estimates suggest at least 80 to 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. Do the math. That's 24,000 to 30,000 pounds of gold. In today's terms, that would be worth somewhere between $600 million and $1 billion, though such comparisons barely capture the relative value in the medieval economy. In 1324, that much gold represented a significant fraction of the circulating currency in North Africa and the Middle East. It was enough wealth to ransom kingdoms, to finance crusades, to build cities, and Mansa Musa was carrying it across the desert to give away. But the caravan was more than treasure. It was a moving city, a self-contained society crossing the Sahara with military precision. There were soldiers, not just the ceremonial staff-bearers, but actual warriors to protect against bandits and rivals. There were servants and slaves to maintain the camp, cook food, tend to animals, and handle the endless logistics of moving 60,000 people through the desert. There were scholars and scribes to document the journey and conduct diplomatic correspondence. There were griots, oral historians and musicians, to preserve the story and entertain the emperor. There were merchants who traveled with the caravan, seeing opportunity in Musa's wake. And there were the animals. Camels, yes, the ships of the desert, perfectly adapted to the environment, but also horses for the elite, goats and sheep for food, dogs for protection. This was not a caravan. This was an empire demonstrating its organizational capacity. Because here's what's truly impressive. They successfully crossed the Sahara. The Sahara Desert in the 14th century was even more hostile than it is today. There were established routes, yes, ancient pathways marked by the bones of those who had failed, but a single mistake could doom hundreds of people. Water sources had to be known with precision. Guides had to be trusted completely. The timing had to account for seasonal variations, sandstorms, and the brutal temperature swings from scorching days to freezing nights. A normal caravan might include a few dozen traders and their guards. A large caravan might reach a few hundred. Mansa Musa moved 60,000 people across one of Earth's harshest environments without losing the bulk of his entourage. That alone should tell you something about Mali's sophistication. This wasn't luck. This was the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge, extensive preparation, and an administrative apparatus capable of executing complex logistics. The route took them northeast from Niani, through Walata, one of Mali's major trading cities, and then into the deep desert, They followed the ancient paths, stopping at oases that had sustained travelers for millennia. At each stop, Musa made his presence known. In Walata, he distributed gold to the local rulers and merchants. In the desert settlements, he paid generously for supplies and services. Word began to spread ahead of the caravan like a wave. The king of Mali was coming, and he was bringing a fortune. As they crossed into what is now southern Algeria, the caravan entered territory controlled by various Berber tribes and small kingdoms. These were people accustomed to wealthy travelers. The trans-Saharan trade had made many of them prosperous. But nothing had prepared them for Mansa Musa. He didn't just pay market prices, he overpaid. Dramatically, ostentatiously, a camel that might normally cost 50 gold pieces? Musa paid 500. A week's provisions for the caravan? He threw gold at the suppliers until they ran out of things to sell. This wasn't stupidity, this was strategy. Every merchant who met Mansa Musa became an evangelist for Mali's wealth. They would travel onward to Cairo, to Damascus, to Mecca, telling everyone they met about the African king who spent gold like water. By the time Musa reached Egypt, his reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. But the journey was also taking its toll, not on the emperor's resources, which seemed inexhaustible, but on the economies of every place he touched. In small desert towns, the sudden influx of gold created immediate inflation. Prices skyrocketed as merchants realized they could charge whatever they wanted to a man who didn't seem to care about cost. Then when the caravan moved on, the local economy would collapse as the gold concentrated in a few hands while goods had been depleted. It was a preview of what was about to happen in Egypt, but on a much smaller scale. Musa seemed unconcerned. He was on a religious journey, yes, but he was also conducting the greatest public relations campaign in medieval history. Every stop was an opportunity to demonstrate that Mali was not some remote backwater, but a sophisticated empire worthy of respect and partnership. The scholars in his entourage would engage in discussions of Islamic law and theology with local religious leaders. The merchants would discuss trade opportunities. The diplomats would make contact with local rulers, establishing relationships that could benefit Mali for generations. This was soft power, exercised with extraordinary skill. And then in the summer of 1324, the caravan reached the Nile Valley. They had arrived in Egypt. The wealthiest, most sophisticated economy in the Mediterranean world was about to learn what happened when you introduced unlimited gold into a finite market. Cairo in 1324 was not just a city, it was the beating heart of the Islamic world's economy. Founded by the Fatimids and expanded by Saladin and his successors, Cairo was where East met West, where the Mediterranean world connected to the Indian Ocean trade networks, where caravans from the Sahara met ships from Yemen and merchants from Venice. Its markets could supply anything a person could imagine: Chinese silk and Indian spices, Persian carpets and Damascus steel, European wool and African ivory. If it existed, it could be bought in Cairo. The city's bazaars hummed with activity in a dozen languages. The great Al-Azhar Mosque University attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. The palaces of the Mamluk sultans rose like mountains of stone and marble. The Mamluks themselves were unique in world history. A warrior caste originally composed of slave soldiers who had seized power and established a dynasty. They controlled Egypt and Syria, defended the Islamic world from Mongol invasions, and presided over an economy that generated tremendous wealth through trade, taxation, and tribute. Egypt was rich, powerful, sophisticated, and Mansa Musa was about to make its leaders feel poor. The caravan approached Cairo from the west, crossing the Nile and entering the city's outskirts. Word of their approach had reached the Sultan, al-Malik al-Nasir Muhammad, who was in his third reign after the complicated dynastic politics typical of the Mamluk court. The Sultan faced a delicate problem. On one hand, Mansa Musa was a Muslim brother, a fellow sovereign making the holy pilgrimage. Islamic law and custom demanded hospitality and respect. On the other hand, Musa was also the ruler of a distant kingdom, an African king about whom the Egyptians knew very little, and protocol required that visiting dignitaries acknowledge the Sultan's supremacy by engaging in certain forms of deference. Specifically, the Sultan expected Musa to kiss the ground before him, a gesture of submission that visiting rulers typically performed. Mansa Musa refused. According to the chronicles, when the Sultan's representatives informed Musa of the protocol, the emperor responded with elegant firmness, "I prostrate myself only before God." This was a brilliant move. By framing his refusal in religious terms, Musa avoided insulting the Sultan while simultaneously asserting his own status as an independent sovereign. He wasn't defying protocol out of arrogance. He was upholding Islamic principles. The Sultan, recognizing the political savvy of this response, accepted the situation. A compromise was reached. Musa would visit the Sultan, but without the prostration. But this diplomatic dance was merely the opening act. When Mansa Musa entered Cairo, the city lost its mind. The emperor didn't just bring gold, he brought spectacle. The golden staffs glinting in the Egyptian sun, the procession of thousands moving through the streets with military precision, the camels loaded with treasure, the exotic dress and bearing of the Malian court. Cairo was accustomed to wealthy visitors. Merchants from across the known world traded there. Ambassadors arrived bearing gifts. The Mamluks themselves displayed wealth with ostentatious architecture in lavish courts. But this was different. This was wealth in motion, wealth personified, wealth that seemed to have no limit. And then Mansa Musa began spending. He distributed gold to everyone he encountered, not coins, handfuls of gold dust. He gave gold to the poor in the streets. He gave gold to the scholars at Al-Azhar. He gave gold to government officials, merchants, and religious leaders. He purchased supplies for his caravan at prices that made merchants weep with joy. He bought gifts for the Sultan, elaborate presents that demonstrated both wealth and diplomatic savvy. He commissioned repairs to mosques and other religious buildings. He funded scholarships for students. He provided dowries for poor women so they could marry. Everywhere Musa went, gold flowed like water from a broken dam. The markets of Cairo had never seen anything like it. Initially, merchants were thrilled. Here was a customer who didn't haggle, didn't bargain, didn't try to negotiate better prices. He simply paid whatever was asked, and usually more. If you had cloth to sell, Musa would buy it at double the normal price. If you offered services, he'd pay in gold dust measured with a generous hand. If you had nothing to sell, he'd give you gold anyway, simply for being there. For about 2 weeks, Cairo experienced an economic euphoria. Merchants became wealthy overnight. Ordinary people found themselves holding more gold than they'd seen in their lives. The markets bustled with activity as people rushed to spend their sudden fortunes on goods and services. But then reality began to assert itself. Gold, like any commodity, has value based on scarcity. When everyone has gold, gold becomes less valuable. It's basic economics, though the medieval world didn't have modern economic theory to explain what was happening. What they had was experience. And experience told them something was very wrong. The collapse began subtly, like cracks spreading through ice. A merchant in the textile bazaar noticed it first. He had sold cloth to one of Mansa Musa's entourage for 3 times the normal price in gold. Delighted, he went to purchase leather from a tanner, intending to expand his business. The tanner had also sold to Musa's people. He also had gold, lots of it. "The price has changed," the tanner said. "Leather now costs more." The textile merchant protested. The price had been stable for years. "Why raise it now?" The tanner shrugged. "Everyone has gold, but I have the same amount of leather as yesterday. If you want it, the price is higher." This conversation, or versions of it, rippled through Cairo's markets like a virus. Within days, the price of grain doubled, then tripled, then quintupled. The price of ordinary goods, bread, cooking oil, vegetables, meat, skyrocketed as merchants realized that the gold flooding the market meant their goods were now more valuable relative to the precious metal. This is inflation in its purest form. Too much money chasing too few goods. But the medieval economy didn't have central banks or monetary policy. They couldn't adjust interest rates or regulate the money supply. The gold was out there circulating through the economy, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop what was happening. For the wealthy elite, this was initially an inconvenience. Prices rose, but they had other forms of wealth. Land, property, political connections. They could weather the storm. For ordinary Egyptians, it was a catastrophe. Imagine you're a baker in Cairo. Yesterday, you could buy enough grain for a week with a small silver coin. Today, that same grain costs gold, actual gold, that you don't have. The wealthy foreign merchants might have gold to throw around, but you don't. Your savings, carefully accumulated over years, suddenly buy half of what they did last month, a quarter of what they did last week. You can't raise the price of your bread fast enough to keep up because your customers don't have gold either. They have Egyptian dinars, which are rapidly losing value. They have silver, which is worth less compared to gold than it was before Mansa Musa arrived. The middle class, merchants, craftsmen, small traders, found themselves squeezed. Their capital was losing value daily. Their ability to do business was compromised by the wildly fluctuating prices. And Mansa Musa stayed in Cairo for 3 months. 3 months of continuous spending. 3 months of gold flowing into the Egyptian economy like a river bursting through a dam. The Egyptian chronicler al-Makrizi, writing decades later, preserved the memory of this economic chaos. Gold was at a high price in Egypt until they came in that year. The mithqal did not go below 25 dirhams and was generally above, but from that time its value fell, and it cheapened in price and has remained cheap till now. Let's decode what he's saying. The mithqal was a unit of gold weight. The dirham was a silver coin. Al-Makrizi is telling us that before Musa arrived, gold was expensive relative to silver, 25 dirhams per mithqal. After Musa left, the value of gold collapsed. It stayed collapsed for years. This represents a fundamental disruption of Egypt's monetary system. But it wasn't just about prices. The economic dislocation created social upheaval. Credit markets froze. If you were a merchant who had loaned money expecting to be repaid in gold, you suddenly discovered that the gold you'd get back was worth far less than what you'd lent. Trust evaporated. Trade partnerships dissolved. Long-standing commercial relationships ended in recriminations and lawsuits. The government tried to respond. The Mamluk administration attempted to control prices, but without understanding the underlying mechanism, their efforts were futile. You can't decree that bread costs X when bakers can't afford to buy grain at any price they can profitably sell at. Tax revenues became complicated. If the government was collecting taxes in gold that was rapidly losing value, the real income of the state was declining even as the nominal amount stayed the same. And through it all, Mansa Musa continued his pilgrimage preparations, seemingly oblivious to the chaos his generosity had created. But was he oblivious? Some historians argue that Musa genuinely didn't understand the economic impact he was having. He came from an economy where gold was abundant, and he was simply being generous according to his culture's values. Others suggest something more calculated. Musa was demonstrating power, not military power, but economic power. He was showing Egypt, and through Egypt the entire Islamic world, that Mali controlled resources beyond their comprehension. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Musa was devout in his faith and genuine in his generosity. Islamic tradition emphasizes charity, and the Hajj was an occasion for exceptional giving. But Musa was also a shrewd politician who understood that reputation and perception were forms of power. Whether he fully grasped the economic mechanics of what he was doing or not, he understood that people would remember this, that the story of his generosity would spread, that Mali's reputation would be transformed from a mysterious source of gold to a recognized superpower. Finally, in the late summer of 1324, Mansa Musa left Cairo to continue his pilgrimage to Mecca. The caravan that departed was smaller than the one that arrived. Thousands of people had chosen to remain in Egypt or continue elsewhere, but still massive by any standard. Cairo watched them go with mixed feelings. The markets were awash in gold, which seemed like a blessing. But prices were chaotic, the economy was destabilized, and a growing number of Egyptians were beginning to realize that Mansa Musa's generosity had come with a devastating price. The emperor traveled onward through the Sinai Peninsula, through the holy cities of Medina and Mecca, performing the rituals of Hajj with the same spectacular generosity he'd shown in Cairo. In Mecca, he purchased property. He gave gifts to the custodians of the holy sites. He met with scholars and pilgrims from across the Islamic world, cementing Mali's place in the consciousness of the Ummah, the global Muslim community. And then, his religious obligations fulfilled, he began the long journey home. But the return trip would be very different from the arrival. Power is a strange thing. We think of it in terms of armies and conquest, of swords and fortifications, of the ability to take what we want by force. But Mansa Musa had discovered a different kind of power, the power to reshape reality through sheer abundance, the power to make an economy bend to your will, not through threats, but through generosity so overwhelming it became destabilizing. He had walked into one of the world's great cities, handed out a fortune, and left it fundamentally changed, without drawing a single sword, without issuing a single threat, without conquering a single foot of territory. It's worth pausing here to consider what that means. We're halfway through a journey that most history books reduce to a footnote. Mansa Musa was very rich. But this story is about so much more than wealth. It's about how power works, about unintended consequences, about the ways a single decision can ripple through history in ways its maker never imagined. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am telling it, consider subscribing. We're building something here, a channel dedicated to the stories that textbooks overlook, the moments that change the world in unexpected ways. Because the story of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage is far from over. The economic chaos he'd unleashed in Egypt was just beginning, and the world was about to learn that you can't flood a medieval economy with gold and expect everything to return to normal when you leave. Let's continue. Mansa Musa's journey home began with a problem he'd never encountered before. He was running out of money. This seems impossible, doesn't it? The man who'd casually handed out tons of gold, who'd purchased anything he desired without a second thought, who'd seemed to have infinite resources. How could he be short on funds? The answer reveals just how much gold he'd distributed. By the time Musa left Mecca and began the return journey, he'd given away or spent so much of his treasure that his remaining resources were insufficient to maintain the caravan in the style to which it had become accustomed. For the first time in his pilgrimage, Mansa Musa had to borrow money. The Chronicle sources tell us he took out loans from Egyptian merchants in Cairo, promising to repay them with interest when he returned to Mali. Think about the psychological shift this represents. Musa had arrived as the embodiment of unlimited wealth. He'd spent 3 months proving that his resources were beyond measure, and now he was borrowing from the very people he'd been showering with gold months earlier. Some merchants must have seen this as an opportunity. Loaning money to an emperor, even at generous interest rates, was likely to be repaid, and it established a commercial relationship with Mali that could prove valuable. But others must have wondered, had the emperor's generosity been foolish? Had he bankrupted himself for the sake of religious obligation and political theater? The truth, as we'll see, was more complex. Musa's borrowing in Cairo served multiple purposes. Yes, he needed funds to complete the journey home, but the loans also created creditors who now had a vested interest in Mali's stability and prosperity. These merchants would become informal ambassadors for Malian trade, spreading knowledge of Mali's wealth and opportunities throughout the Mediterranean commercial networks. Even when borrowing, Musa was conducting diplomacy. The return journey followed a different route, south through the Sahara, but with stops in different cities and oases. The caravan was smaller now, streamlined, moving faster, but everywhere they stopped, people had heard the stories. The king of Mali who'd broken Egypt's economy with his generosity. The emperor who carried staffs of solid gold. The ruler of a land so rich that gold was as common as sand. The legend was growing, taking on a life of its own. In small desert settlements, people came out just to see the caravan pass. Merchants tried to establish trading relationships. Local rulers sent envoys with gifts, hoping to create diplomatic ties with this newly famous emperor. Musa's pilgrimage had accomplished exactly what he'd intended. It had put Mali on the map, but maps in 1324 were about to become very literal. As Mansa Musa made his way back to Mali, word of his journey was spreading through the Islamic world and beginning to reach Europe. Merchants who'd met him in Cairo were telling the story in Venice and Genoa. Scholars who'd spoken with his entourage were writing letters describing this African emperor of unimaginable wealth. And European cartographers were listening. In 1375, a Jewish cartographer named Abraham Kresk created what became known as the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval period. And there in the interior of West Africa, Kresges drew something unprecedented, a black king sitting on a throne, holding a golden orb, with a crown upon his head. Beneath the image, the text read, "This Negro lord is called Musa Mali, lord of the Negroes of Guinea. So abundant is the gold which is found in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land." For the first time, a European map acknowledged not just the existence of West African kingdoms, but their wealth and power. Mansa Musa had become an icon, a symbol of African prosperity that contradicted every stereotype Europeans held about the continent. But symbols and reality are different things. And back in Egypt, the reality of what Musa had done was becoming increasingly apparent. The economic chaos Mansa Musa left behind didn't resolve itself quickly. In fact, it got worse. Remember, inflation doesn't simply reverse when the cause disappears. The gold Musa had distributed didn't vanish when he left Cairo. It remained in circulation, concentrated in the hands of merchants and elites who had been fortunate enough to encounter the emperor during his stay. The Egyptian economy in 1324 was sophisticated, but it wasn't designed to absorb such a massive, sudden influx of precious metal. Here's what happened in the months and years following Musa's departure. First, the immediate inflation in commodity prices continued. Grain, the foundation of Egypt's food supply, remained expensive. This hit the poor hardest, as economic shocks always do. Bread riots and social unrest became more common. Second, the value of gold relative to other forms of currency remained depressed. Al-Makrizi's chronicle specifically states that gold's value remained cheap for years afterward. This meant that Egypt's monetary system, which relied on a stable relationship between gold and silver currencies, was fundamentally disrupted. For merchants engaged in international trade, this created nightmares. Imagine you're an Egyptian trader doing business with Venice. Your Venetian partners expect to be paid in gold of a certain value, but the gold you're paying with is worth less than it was before Musa's visit, meaning you need to provide more gold to settle the same debt. Your profit margins evaporate. Your business model stops working. Some merchants went bankrupt. Trade partnerships that had lasted generations dissolved. The commercial networks that made Cairo the hub of Mediterranean-Indian Ocean trade were stressed to the breaking point. Third, the government's finances were severely impacted. The Mamluk Sultanate relied on tax revenue from trade, from agricultural production, and from various forms of tribute and fees. When prices became chaotic and commercial activity was disrupted, tax collection became more difficult. Moreover, the government's own expenses were rising. The Mamluks maintained a large military. They had to, given the threats from Crusaders, Mongols, and rival Islamic states. Paying soldiers in currency that was rapidly losing value created unrest in the ranks. The Sultan's solution was to try to recover some of the gold that had flooded the market. Some sources suggest that the Egyptian government actually began buying gold from merchants at above-market rates, trying to reduce the supply and circulation. Others indicate that taxes were collected preferentially in gold, pulling it out of the general economy. These efforts had limited success. The fundamental problem was that Musa had introduced too much gold too quickly into an economy with limited absorption capacity. No government intervention could quickly reverse that. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, Egypt's position as the economic hub of the region was weakened. Before Musa's pilgrimage, Cairo had been the undisputed financial center of the Eastern Mediterranean and the link to Indian Ocean trade. Its currency was stable, its markets were reliable, and its commercial networks were well established. After the pilgrimage, merchants began to look for alternatives. Some trade shifted to Damascus, some to Alexandria, which had been less affected by Musa's spending, some to Mediterranean ports that dealt more directly with European traders. Cairo remained important. You can't replace a city of that size and significance overnight, but its dominance was diminished. The damage lasted for more than a decade. Al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century, had access to records and testimonies from people who remembered the event or who had heard about it from their parents and grandparents. His chronicle makes clear that Egyptians viewed Mansa Musa's visit as an economic disaster that had long-lasting consequences. But here's what's fascinating. Even as they cursed the inflation and economic disruption, Egyptians also spoke of Musa with a kind of awe. The stories emphasized his generosity, his piety, his dignified bearing. He was remembered as a righteous king, a man who gave freely to the poor, who respected Islamic law, who treated people with kindness. The economic damage was undeniable, but the cultural memory was more complex, a mixture of resentment and admiration, of recognition that Musa had fundamentally changed how the Islamic world viewed sub-Saharan Africa. Because ultimately, the economic impact, as severe as it was, would eventually fade. Egypt's economy would recover, trade patterns would stabilize, the monetary system would adjust. But the transformation of Africa's image in the eyes of the world, that was permanent. Before Mansa Musa, Africa south of the Sahara was a mystery to most Muslims and Europeans. A source of gold and ivory and slaves, yes, but not a place of sophisticated kingdoms, great learning, or powerful rulers. After Mansa Musa, that was impossible to believe. Merchants who'd met him told stories of his sophistication, his intelligence, his grasp of Islamic theology and law. Scholars who'd debated with his entourage spoke of the learning in Timbuktu and other Malian cities. Diplomats reported on the complexity of Mali's government and its vast territory. And everyone spoke of the gold. The pilgrimage had been expensive for Egypt, but for Mali, it was the greatest investment in soft power ever made. News travels slowly in the medieval world, but it travels. By ship across the Mediterranean, by caravan across the Sahara, through letters carried by merchants and pilgrims, through stories told and retold until they take on the quality of legend. The story of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage traveled everywhere. In Damascus and Baghdad, scholars discuss the theological implications of such extraordinary wealth. Was it righteous to possess so much when others had so little? Was Musa's generosity an example to be emulated or a display of pride? In the ports of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, merchants recalculated their understanding of global trade. If Mali controlled that much gold, shouldn't they be establishing direct commercial relationships rather than relying on intermediaries? In the Saharan trading cities, Sijil Massa, Fez, Marrakesh, traders who'd built fortunes on the trans-Saharan gold trade found renewed interest in their routes and connections. And in Europe, the Mansa Musa story arrived as a revelation. Medieval Europe was gold-starved. The continent had limited gold deposits, and what gold it had was constantly flowing eastward to pay for spices, silk, and other luxury goods from Asia. European kingdoms struggled to maintain adequate currency supplies. The idea that somewhere in Africa there existed a king who had so much gold he could destabilize another economy just by giving it away, this was revolutionary. It challenged European assumptions about African inferiority. It suggested that perhaps the dark continent was dark only because of European ignorance, not African deficiency. The Catalan Atlas, created 50 years after Musa's pilgrimage, reflected this changed understanding. Cresques didn't draw Mansa Musa as a savage or a curiosity. He drew him as a king, powerful, wealthy, and worthy of respect. Other maps followed. The image of the African king holding gold became a standard feature of European cartography for centuries. It was often inaccurate in details. Cartographers still didn't know the exact location of Mali's cities or the precise extent of its territory, but it represented a fundamental shift in perception. Africa was no longer just a place to extract resources. It was a place where kingdoms rose and fell, where rulers commanded power, where civilization flourished. But maps and stories weren't the only legacy. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage had practical economic consequences that rippled through the medieval trading system for decades. First, it drew increased attention to the trans-Saharan trade routes. Merchants who might have focused on other regions now saw opportunity in establishing connections with Mali. The trade in gold, salt, copper, and slaves intensified. Second, it influenced the development of West African Islam. Musa had traveled with scholars and returned with more, bringing back architects, teachers, and religious leaders from Egypt and Arabia. These men would help build mosques, establish madrasas, Islamic schools, and deepen the Islamic character of Mali's cities. Timbuktu, in particular, would become one of the great centers of Islamic learning, with libraries and universities that rivaled those in Cairo and Baghdad. This was a direct result of Musa's pilgrimage and the connections he established. Third, it changed diplomatic relationships. Mali went from being a distant, mysterious source of gold to being a recognized player in the Islamic world's political landscape. When Malian ambassadors arrived in other courts, they were received as representatives of a legitimate power. The pilgrimage had been expensive, ruinously so if you just counted the gold given away. But the return on investment in terms of political influence, cultural prestige, and economic opportunity was incalculable. Musa had shown the world that Mali was not merely rich, it was sophisticated, organized, powerful, worthy of respect. And he'd done it without conquering a single city, without fighting a single battle, without threatening a single rival. He'd done it with gold, with generosity, with a calculated display of wealth so overwhelming that it became undeniable. When Mansa Musa finally returned to Niani after more than a year away, he came back to an empire that was stable, but facing new challenges. In his absence, his deputies had managed the day-to-day governance. But there were questions that only the emperor could answer. Disputes between provinces, challenges from neighboring kingdoms, decisions about resource allocation in military deployments. Musa threw himself into the work of administration with the same intensity he'd brought to his pilgrimage. But he was also thinking bigger now. The journey had expanded his vision of what Mali could become. He'd seen the great cities of North Africa and the Middle East. He'd witnessed the architectural achievements of Cairo and Mecca. He'd discussed theology and philosophy with some of the greatest minds in the Islamic world. And he returned determined to make Mali their equal. The first major project was architectural. Musa commissioned the construction of mosques in Gao and Timbuktu, massive structures built in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style, with walls of mud brick and timber that would last for centuries. He brought back with him an architect known as Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, often called Es-Saheli. The historical records are unclear about exactly what Es-Saheli built. Various sources credit him with different structures. But what's certain is that Musa invested heavily in monumental architecture that would demonstrate Mali's cultural sophistication. The Jingoreber Mosque in Timbuktu, with its distinctive pyramidal minaret and massive prayer hall, still stands today, a testament to the architectural ambitions Musa brought back from his Hajj. But buildings were just one part of a broader transformation. Musa also invested in education. The scholars he brought back from the Middle East didn't just build mosques. They established schools. They created libraries. They attracted students from across West Africa who wanted to study Islamic law, theology, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Timbuktu became a city where books were more valuable than gold, where merchants traded in manuscripts, where scholars debated the finer points of hadith interpretation and astronomical calculations. This was Musa's vision, a Mali that was not just wealthy in gold, but wealthy in knowledge. The economic impact of the pilgrimage on Mali itself is harder to assess. Musa had spent an enormous amount of gold, but Mali's goldfields continued to produce. The trans-Saharan trade continued to flow. If anything, the increased international attention actually benefited Mali's economy by raising the profile of its exports. And those loans Musa had taken in Cairo? Contemporary sources suggest they were repaid with interest within a few years. Mali's gold production was more than sufficient to cover the debt. But Musa's greatest achievement wasn't economic or architectural. It was the transformation of how Mali saw itself. Before the pilgrimage, Mali was a regional power, dominant in West Africa, respected by its neighbors, but provincial in its outlook. After the pilgrimage, Mali understood itself as a world power. Its emperor had walked among sultans and scholars as an equal. Its wealth had been recognized from Cairo to Mecca. Its sophistication had been demonstrated on the world stage. This shift in self-perception mattered. It influenced how Malian rulers approached diplomacy, how they invested in culture and education, how they projected power. Mansa Musa ruled for another 13 years after returning from his pilgrimage. In that time, Mali reached the zenith of its power and influence. The empire stretched from the Atlantic coast to the edges of modern Nigeria, from the Sahara to the forests of the south. Trade flourished, cities grew, scholarship thrived. And everywhere, from the markets of Cairo to the courts of European kings to the trading posts of the Sahara, people spoke of Mansa Musa, the emperor who had broken Egypt's economy with his generosity. When Musa died in 1337, he left behind an empire at its peak. But he also left a question that his successors would struggle to answer. How do you follow a legend? The Mali Empire didn't end with Mansa Musa's death. It continued for nearly 2 more centuries, though it never again reached the heights of prosperity and international recognition it had achieved under Musa's rule. His successors, his sons and grandsons, struggled with the impossible task of living up to his legacy. How do you govern when your predecessor is remembered as the richest man who ever lived? How do you project power when every diplomatic encounter is compared to a pilgrimage that broke an economy? Some tried to emulate Musa's grand gestures. Others focused on military expansion or administrative reform. None achieved the same combination of wealth, piety, and political theater that had made Musa unforgettable. The empire faced challenges from within and without. Provincial rulers sought greater autonomy. Neighboring kingdoms probed for weaknesses. The Songhai Empire, formerly a tributary state, grew increasingly powerful and eventually conquered much of Mali's eastern territories. By the 16th century, Mali had fragmented into smaller kingdoms. The great days were over, but the memory of Mansa Musa endured. In West African oral traditions, he became a symbol of righteous rulership, a king who balanced power with piety, wealth with generosity. The griots sang of his pilgrimage for generations, embellishing and elaborating the story until it took on mythic proportions. In the Islamic world, he was remembered as an exemplar of Hajj, a man who had fulfilled the pillar of pilgrimage with unprecedented devotion and generosity. In Europe, he became a symbol of African wealth and sophistication that challenged racist assumptions about the continent. And in Egypt, the memory was more complicated. The economic damage he'd caused faded with time. Egypt's economy recovered, trade patterns stabilized, the monetary disruption was eventually absorbed. But the event itself was never forgotten. Al-Makrizi's chronicle, written a century later, preserved the details with remarkable clarity. The Egyptian memory of Mansa Musa combined economic trauma with cultural fascination, an acknowledgement that this African emperor had fundamentally changed their world, for better and worse. Modern historians debate various aspects of the story. How much gold did Musa really bring? Was the economic damage as severe as the chronicles suggest? Did he understand what he was doing, or was he simply naive about economics? These debates miss the larger point. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage succeeded in exactly what it was meant to do. It forced the world to acknowledge Mali as a major power. It transformed perceptions of Africa. It created diplomatic and commercial relationships that benefited Mali for generations. Yes, it destabilized Egypt's economy. Yes, it caused hardship for ordinary Egyptians. Yes, there were unintended consequences. But from Musa's perspective, from Mali's perspective, the pilgrimage was an unqualified success. He'd invested a fortune in soft power and received dividends in prestige, influence, and recognition that lasted long after the gold was spent. Think about what we remember. We don't remember the names of most medieval European kings. We've forgotten the sultans who ruled Egypt in the 14th century. We don't know the names of the merchants who got rich or poor from Musa's gold. But we remember Mansa Musa. 700 years later, his name is still synonymous with wealth. His pilgrimage is still studied. His legacy still influences how we think about African history, about the medieval world, about the relationship between wealth and power. And perhaps most importantly, his story challenges the narrative that so many of us absorbed in school. The narrative that Africa before colonialism was primitive, poor, and peripheral to world history. Mansa Musa proved that wrong in the most spectacular way possible. He didn't write treatises or build monuments that would last millennia. He simply walked across the Sahara with so much gold that everywhere he went, people couldn't stop talking about it. They're still talking about it. That's power. That's legacy. There's something profound about a king who changes the world without ever drawing a sword. Mansa Musa didn't conquer Egypt. He didn't lay siege to Cairo. He didn't threaten the Sultan or demand tribute or impose his will through violence. He simply passed through. But that passage was so overwhelming, so unprecedented, so saturated with wealth and spectacle and generosity, that it broke the economic foundations of the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. And when he left, Egypt was never quite the same. Neither was the world's understanding of Africa. Neither was Mali's position in the global order. Neither was the Islamic world's perception of what African Islam could be. One journey, 1 year, one man with more gold than sense, or perhaps with more sense than anyone realized. The medieval world was full of conquerors, men who built empires through blood and steel, men whose names were written in the cities they destroyed and the peoples they subjugated. History remembers them, yes, but it remembers them with a mixture of awe and horror. Mansa Musa is remembered differently. He's remembered as the man who was so rich he accidentally broke an economy, as the emperor who took Islamic piety to its logical extreme, as the African king who forced the world to acknowledge Africa's power. He proved that there are many forms of power, that generosity can be as transformative as violence, that reputation and prestige can be purchased, if you have enough gold. And he left us with a question that resonates across 7 centuries. What would you do with unlimited wealth? Would you hoard it, invest it, use it to build monuments to yourself? Or would you, like Mansa Musa, give it away so freely that centuries later, people are still trying to calculate the economic impact? Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most extraordinary stories. If you found this fascinating, if you learned something that changes how you think about Africa, about the medieval world, about the nature of power itself, then consider subscribing. We're building a library of the stories that textbooks ignore, the moments that changed history in unexpected ways, the people whose legacies deserve to be remembered. Mansa Musa walked through Egypt 700 years ago and left it transformed. His story deserves to transform how we see history. Until next time, remember, power takes many forms, and sometimes the most lasting victories are won not with swords, but with gold.